What if the mixed signals, the distance, and the constant push and pull aren't signs that it's falling apart, but proof that something deeper is actually trying to form? Welcome back to Distant Soul, where we explore the deeper truths behind love, connection, and human behavior. Today, we're uncovering why relationships with avoidant partners feel like a push and pull, and what it really means when that connection keeps coming back. If you and an avoidant person are genuinely meant to end up together, it rarely unfolds like a perfect love story. It won't feel smooth or predictable. In the beginning, it often feels confusing, like you're being drawn in one moment and then pushed away the next. That's because with an avoidant, love doesn't follow a straight path. It moves in waves, connection, then distance, then connection again. Most people see this pattern and assume it means the relationship isn't right. But the truth is, this push and pull dynamic is often the very thing that tests whether the bond has the strength to survive. It usually begins with a deep emotional connection that's hard to explain. Even the avoidant feels it, though they may never fully express it. Around you, they feel understood, calm, and comfortable in a way that's unfamiliar to them. But at the same time, that closeness activates something deeper within them: fear. Not fear of you, but fear of losing control, fear of becoming too dependent, and fear of getting hurt in ways they can't manage. So just when things start to feel meaningful and real, they begin to withdraw. This is the point where most people react by chasing. They try to fix the situation, communicate more, give more love, hoping it will bring the avoidant back. But when the connection is truly meant to grow, something shifts within you instead. You stop chasing. You begin to see that their distance isn't about rejecting you, it's their way of protecting themselves. And instead of reacting with emotion, you start responding with calmness and self-respect. That change makes all the difference. For the first time, the avoidant experiences a connection where they aren't being pursued or pressured. They can feel your presence, but they also sense your independence. And that creates a different kind of attraction, one rooted in emotional safety, not emotional pressure. So after creating distance, they begin to return. And this pattern continues. They come closer, then pull away, then come back again. But here's where everything starts to change. When a connection is truly meant to unfold, every time they return, there's a subtle shift. The space between you doesn't last as long, they find their way back a little sooner, and the bond feels slightly deeper than before. It's not flawless, but it's real progress. As time passes, the avoidant doesn't just start trusting you, they begin to trust the connection itself. They slowly realize that getting close doesn't mean losing who they are. They see that you're not trying to control them, change them, or confine them. And little by little, their defenses begin to soften. Not all at once, but gradually, layer by layer. At the same time, you're evolving too. You become more steady, more centered, less emotionally reactive. Your sense of security no longer depends on whether they're close or distant. You're with them because you want to be, not because you feel incomplete without them. And that shift creates balance, the kind that allows the connection to actually last. Because the reality is, an avoidant can only stay with someone who doesn't lose themselves trying to keep them. And you can only stay grounded with an avoidant when you stop taking their distance as something personal. When both of these shifts happen together, something rare begins to take shape. Eventually, there's a quiet turning point. It's not dramatic, and it doesn't come with some big declaration, but you'll feel it. They stop pulling away as far as they used to. They begin to open up more consistently. Instead of just tolerating closeness, they start choosing it, and that's when something clicks. You realize this connection didn't survive because it was easy, it lasted because both of you grew enough to meet in the middle. So if you're in a situation where an avoidant keeps coming back, don't just look at the pattern itself, pay attention to what's evolving within it. Are they becoming more open over time? Are you becoming more secure within yourself? Is the bond deepening even if it's happening slowly? Because when you and an avoidant are truly meant to be, this is what happens. The relationship changes both of you. It demands growth, patience, and emotional depth in ways most connections never will. And in the end, it's not intensity that keeps it alive. It's the transformation. There's another layer to this dynamic that most people don't talk about, and it's the internal experience of the avoidant themselves. From the outside, it can look like they're indifferent or emotionally unavailable, but internally, it's often the opposite. They feel the connection just as strongly, sometimes even more intensely, but they don't have the same capacity to stay regulated within it. So when emotions rise, their instinct isn't to lean in, it's to create space so they can feel in control again. That's why their distance can feel so sudden. One moment they're fully present, open and engaged, and the next they seem cold or disconnected. But what's really happening is a kind of emotional overload. They aren't stepping away because the connection means nothing. They're stepping away because it means too much, and they don't know how to hold it safely. This is also why timing plays such a crucial role. You can have a deep, genuine connection with an avoidant, but if they haven't reached a point where they're willing to face their own patterns, the cycle can repeat without real progress. The difference between a connection that evolves and one that stays stuck isn't just love, it's awareness. At some point, they have to recognize their own behavior, not as something that protects them, but as something that also keeps them from experiencing the closeness they actually want. At the same time, your role isn't to teach or fix them. That's where many people lose themselves. They become overly patient, overly understanding, and start tolerating behavior that slowly erodes their own emotional stability. Growth in this kind of connection only happens when both people take responsibility for themselves. You hold your boundaries, and they face their fears. Without both, the pattern doesn't transform, it just repeats. There's also a deeper emotional shift that happens when you stop chasing. It's not just about giving them space, it's about reclaiming your own energy. When you stop trying to manage their feelings or predict their next move, you become more present in your own life. You start to notice that your peace doesn't have to depend on their consistency. And ironically, this is often when the avoidant feels safer coming closer because the pressure is gone. But it's important to understand that this kind of connection isn't for everyone. It requires a level of emotional strength and self-awareness that many people aren't ready for, and that's okay. There's a difference between a connection that challenges you to grow and one that constantly drains you. If the pattern never evolves, if the distance stays the same or becomes more painful over time, then it's not a sign of destiny, it's a sign of misalignment. When it is aligned, though, the growth becomes visible. Conversations become more honest. The avoidant starts to communicate instead of disappearing. The space between you no longer feels like abandonment, but like a natural rhythm that both of you understand. And trust begins to replace anxiety. Another important piece is emotional consistency. Avoidants often test, not intentionally, but through their behavior. They pull away and subconsciously observe what happens next. If they feel pressure, guilt, or emotional intensity directed at them, it reinforces their belief that closeness is overwhelming. But if they experience calm, steady energy, someone who doesn't collapse or react impulsively, it slowly rewires their perception of intimacy. And over time, what once felt threatening to them starts to feel safe. That's when the connection begins to stabilize, not because the avoidant has completely changed, but because both of you have learned how to meet each other in a healthier way. There's more understanding, more patience, but also more boundaries and self-respect. In the end, this kind of relationship teaches something deeper than just love. It teaches emotional independence, resilience, and the ability to stay grounded even when things feel uncertain. And if both people continue to grow, what once felt like instability can turn into something steady, not perfect, but real, balanced, and lasting. There's also a deeper psychological pattern underneath all of this that shapes how the dynamic plays out over time. Avoidant individuals often learned early on that closeness comes with discomfort, pressure, or loss of control. So even when they genuinely want connection, their nervous system reacts as if it's something risky. That's why their behavior can seem so contradictory. They move toward what they want and then instinctively move away from it. What makes this even more complex is that the connection with you often feels different from anything they've experienced before. It challenges their usual patterns. They may find themselves thinking about you more, feeling more emotionally affected, or noticing a level of comfort they don't typically allow. And instead of simply enjoying that, it can create internal conflict. Part of them wants to stay, while another part feels the need to retreat and regain emotional distance. This is where many connections either grow or fall apart. If every moment of distance is met with pressure, urgency, or emotional reactions, it reinforces their belief that closeness leads to overwhelm. But when the energy shifts, when you remain steady, grounded, and not consumed by their inconsistency, it creates a different experience for them. They begin to associate closeness with calm instead of chaos. At the same time, it's important to recognize that patience alone isn't enough. There has to be movement. Real change shows up in small but meaningful ways. They might start communicating before disappearing, even if it's brief. They may take longer to pull away or come back with more openness than before. These subtle changes are often more important than grand gestures because they show a shift in their internal response to connection. You'll also notice a change in how conflict is handled. In the earlier stages, any emotional intensity might cause them to shut down or withdraw completely. But as the connection evolves, they begin to tolerate those moments instead of escaping them. They might still need space, but they won't disappear in the same way. There's more effort to stay connected, even when it's uncomfortable. Another important aspect is how your own standards begin to solidify. At first, you might have been more focused on keeping the connection alive at any cost, but over time, you start valuing your own emotional stability just as much. You become clearer about what you will and won't accept. And this isn't about ultimatums or control, it's about self-respect. You're no longer trying to earn consistency, you expect it. This shift changes the dynamic in a powerful way. The avoidant begins to sense that the connection is no longer something they can drift in and out of without consequence. Not in a threatening way, but in a grounded, self-assured way. And that often motivates them to show up more intentionally because they recognize the value of what they could lose. There's also a moment where the emotional intensity starts to settle. In the beginning, everything can feel heightened. The attraction, the confusion, the uncertainty. But as both of you grow, that intensity transforms into something steadier. It becomes less about emotional highs and lows and more about consistency, understanding, and mutual effort. And that's the real turning point. Not when everything feels perfect, but when it feels stable enough to build on. It's also worth understanding that not every avoidant connection reaches this stage. Some remain stuck in the cycle because one or both people aren't ready to grow beyond it. That's why awareness is so important. You have to be honest about whether things are actually improving or if you're holding on to potential instead of reality. When it does evolve, though, the connection becomes something very different from how it started. There's more emotional depth, but also more ease. The avoidant no longer sees closeness as something to escape, but something they can handle. And you no longer feel like you're waiting or guessing, you feel secure in what's being built. In the end, this kind of relationship isn't about chasing clarity or forcing outcomes. It's about watching how both people change over time. It's about recognizing whether the connection is moving towards something healthier or simply repeating itself in different forms. And when it truly works, it doesn't just bring two people together, it reshapes how both of you understand connection, trust, and what it means to stay without losing yourself. There's also an important difference between someone who is avoidant and someone who is simply inconsistent or uninterested, and understanding that can save you a lot of confusion. An avoidant person may pull away, but they don't disappear without any pattern or meaning. There's usually a rhythm to their behavior. They come close, feel something real, then retreat, and eventually return. Someone who isn't invested, on the other hand, doesn't follow that cycle with emotional depth. They don't come back with intention or growth. They just drift, This is why it's so important to observe actions over time instead of getting attached to isolated moments. Anyone can show up strongly once or twice. What matters is whether their behavior evolves. Are they making small efforts to stay connected? Are they becoming more aware of how their distance affects you? Even subtle accountability is a sign of growth. Without that, the connection stays one-sided, no matter how strong it feels emotionally. Another layer to this is how silence is interpreted. With an avoidant, silence often isn't about punishment or manipulation, it's about regulation. They use space to process their emotions and regain a sense of control. But that doesn't mean all silence is healthy or acceptable. The key difference is whether they reconnect in a way that acknowledges the gap. If they return and act as if nothing happened, without any effort to rebuild connection, that creates instability. But if they come back with more awareness, even in small ways, it shows movement. You'll also start to notice that the connection becomes less about guessing and more about understanding. In the early stages, everything feels uncertain. You're trying to interpret their behavior, wondering what their distance means, questioning where you stand. But as both of you grow, that confusion begins to fade. Not because everything is constantly clear, but because there's enough consistency to create trust. There's also a shift in emotional responsibility. At first, it might feel like you're carrying the weight of the connection, trying to maintain it, stabilize it, and make sense of it. But over time, that balance changes. The avoidant begins to take more initiative. They start reaching out, opening up, or making an effort to maintain closeness in their own way. It may not look perfect or traditional, but it becomes more mutual. Another important sign of progress is how vulnerability shows up. Avoidants don't usually open up all at once. Their vulnerability often comes in small, controlled pieces. They might share something personal and then pull back again. But each time they do, it's a step forward. The key is whether those moments increase over time. If they do, it means they're slowly learning that being open doesn't automatically lead to loss or pain. At the same time, you'll likely notice that your own emotional reactions become more stable. The things that once triggered anxiety or overthinking begin to feel less intense. You're no longer analyzing every detail or waiting for reassurance. There's a growing sense of internal security that isn't dependent on constant validation. This is where the connection starts to feel different. It's no longer driven by uncertainty or emotional highs and lows. Instead, it becomes something quieter but stronger. There's a sense of knowing, not because everything is perfect, but because there's enough consistency and effort on both sides. It's also important to recognize that boundaries become clearer as the connection matures. You're no longer accepting behavior that leaves you feeling confused or undervalued. And interestingly, this often deepens the connection rather than weakening it. Because when an avoidant sees that you respect yourself, it changes how they engage. They begin to understand that closeness doesn't mean losing control. It means meeting someone who also values themselves. Over time, the relationship starts to move out of survival mode. In the beginning, it can feel like you're constantly trying to hold on to it, trying to understand it, trying to make it work. But as growth happens, it becomes less about effort and more about alignment. Things start to flow more naturally. Communication improves. The distance doesn't feel as threatening, and the connection feels more grounded. And that's when you realize something important. What once felt uncertain and unstable has turned into something steady. Not because the avoidance suddenly became completely different, but because both of you learned how to navigate the connection in a healthier way. In the end, this kind of dynamic teaches you to pay attention to patterns, not promises. It teaches you to value consistency over intensity. And most importantly, it shows you that real connection isn't about never facing challenges. It's about whether those challenges lead to growth or keep you stuck in the same place. There's also a subtle emotional exchange happening beneath the surface that most people don't notice. When you're dealing with an avoidant, it's not just about what they do, it's about what they feel when they're around you versus when they're away from you. In your presence, they may feel calm, connected, even understood in a way they're not used to. But once they step away, their mind starts to reanalyze everything. That's when doubt, fear, and the need for independence take over, so the distance you experience is often influenced more by what happens after the interaction than during it. This is why consistency in your energy matters more than intensity. Intensity can pull them in, but it can also overwhelm them just as quickly. Calm, grounded energy, on the other hand, creates a sense of safety that lingers even when you're not physically present. Over time, they begin to associate you not with pressure or expectation, but with peace. And that's what slowly changes their instinct to run. There's also a deeper truth about control in these dynamics. Avoidants don't just fear emotional pain, they fear losing control over themselves. So when they feel deeply connected, it can trigger the belief that they're giving up that control. That's why any behavior that feels like pressure, even if it comes from a place of love, can push them further away. But when they experience a connection where they still feel free, where closeness doesn't come with demands, it starts to reshape that belief. At the same time, your growth isn't just about becoming more patient or understanding, it's about becoming more discerning. You start recognizing the difference between giving space and abandoning your own needs. You learn that real balance doesn't mean tolerating inconsistency forever. It means allowing room for growth while also expecting movement. Without that, you risk staying in a cycle that feels meaningful but doesn't actually progress. Another shift that happens over time is in how attraction itself is experienced. In the beginning, attraction may be fueled by uncertainty and emotional highs and lows. But as both of you evolve, attraction becomes quieter and more stable. It's no longer driven by fear of losing each other, but by a genuine desire to stay connected. That kind of attraction lasts longer because it's not dependent on emotional extremes. You may also notice that communication begins to change in tone, even if it's still limited. Avoidants don't suddenly become expressive overnight, but their words start to carry more intention. They might check in more often, share small details about their life, or respond with more consistency. These small shifts are significant because they show that they're learning to stay present instead of disconnecting completely. There's also an important moment where you stop trying to interpret every action. Early on, you might analyze every message, every pause, every change in behavior. But as you become more secure, that need fades. You trust what's being built instead of constantly questioning it. And that inner stability reduces the emotional pressure within the connection. At a deeper level, this kind of dynamic forces both people to confront their own patterns. The avoidant has to face their instinct to withdraw, while you may have to face any tendency to chase, overgive, or seek reassurance. When both people become aware of these patterns, the connection becomes less reactive and more intentional. And this is where something meaningful begins to form, not just a relationship, but a different way of relating. There's more space, but also more understanding, more independence, but also more connection. It's no longer about trying to make the other person behave a certain way, but about creating an environment where both people can show up more fully. Still, it's important to stay honest with yourself throughout the process. Growth should feel like progress, not just patience. You should be able to look back and see that something is changing, even if it's slow. If everything feels the same after a long time, then it's worth questioning whether the connection is truly evolving or simply repeating itself. When it does evolve, though, the relationship begins to feel lighter. There's less confusion, less emotional strain, and more clarity about where you stand. The avoidant no longer sees closeness as something to escape, and you no longer feel like you have to hold everything together. In the end, this kind of connection teaches you something deeper than just how to be with someone. It teaches you how to be with yourself. It shows you how to stay grounded in uncertainty, how to love without losing your identity, and how to recognize the difference between a connection that's growing and one that's just repeating a pattern. In the end, a connection with an avoidant isn't defined by how intense it feels in the beginning, but by how much both people are willing to grow through it. It's not about chasing, fixing, or holding on tighter. It's about evolving into someone who can stand steady with or without their presence. If it's truly meant to be, the pattern won't stay the same. The distance will shorten, the returns will feel more intentional, and the connection will slowly become more stable. They'll begin to open up, and you'll become more grounded. And somewhere along the way, the chaos turns into clarity. But if nothing changes, if the cycle repeats without growth, then it's not a sign of destiny, it's a sign to let go.